which is based out of Minneapolis. And they have a branch in Fargo, North Dakota, doing things with North Dakota legislature. I really want to focus today on what's going on in Minnesota with the fraud. They played a significant part of helping get the word out and have been calling out the Governor Tim Walz and pushing the envelope on it, and played a part in moving the conservative agenda, whether it's education and lots of fraud that goes on in government as a rule. Because I recall having John back on the show a couple different times back over the last few years and sharing some of the things with the BSG that's gone on and the craziness in Minnesota and some of their politics. So, John, welcome to Open Range.
Great to be with you.
John, before we dig into fraud in Minnesota, which is going to be our entire show, I do want people to know a little bit about you and about your organization, which I think is terrific of what you guys have been doing to lead the conservative bandwagon, if you will, and the charge in so much of this liberal craziness going on across this country.
Sure. American Experiment, we've been around since the 1990s. I've been running the organization since 2016. And we're a policy organization, think tank. We're the main policy organization in Minnesota. But we're different from a lot of policy organizations in that we're activists. We do everything from putting up billboards to being all over social media. We are very active in the legislature. Our policy fellows testify continually in front of legislative committees. We have a quarterly magazine, Thinking Minnesota, which is very popular. And so we do a whole lot of stuff to educate and to inform and to motivate and to mobilize Minnesotans and now North Dakotans on behalf of conservative principles.
You know, John, when I look at what you've helped do in North Dakota, we're being such a red state. And I recall Minnesota being the only state when Ronald Reagan, I think, ran for re-election. He won 49 out of the 50 states. The only one he didn't carry was Minnesota. And Minnesota's continually stayed blue. They're just Democrat all the way. But your legislature is just on the bubble, isn't it? Don't the Republicans control the House and really close on the Senate?
Minnesota is much closer. It's not as blue a state as a lot of people around the country think, because you're right. We have consistently, ever since Richard Nixon, we have now gone Democrat in presidential elections. But actually, it's much closer than that. So our legislature couldn't mathematically be any closer than it is. It is exactly tied 67 to 67 in the House between Republicans and Democrats, and we have a Republican Speaker of the House, in fact. And in the Senate, it's 34-33. The Democrats have a one-vote edge. Now, actually, there's a couple of vacancies right now, especially elections coming up. But assuming that the same parties hold those seats, it'll be 34-33. And so the legislature couldn't possibly be any closer. And in 2024, while our candidate, the Republicans' candidate for governor, lost by about 8 points, the Republican candidates for the other statewide offices, particularly auditor and attorney general, came very close. Those are very close races. And so there's a lot of opportunity for the conservative cause in Minnesota, and we'll see what happens in 2026.
John, when we take a look at the governor's race, Tim Walz just obviously ran for vice president with Kamala Harris and bragging about the welfare state of how Minnesota is the example for what the rest of the country should look like. Obviously, we're going to talk and focus on the fraud. But he just announced this past week that he was going to not seek re-election, which tells me that this scandal is worse than maybe even we're hearing. So talk a little bit about that governor's race and Tim Walz deciding not to run and what it may look like for Republicans.
There have been indications for a while now that the National Democratic Party may force Tim Walz out of the race. At one point a few weeks ago, there were news stories and op-eds in both the New York Times and the Washington Post, loyal Democratic Party news sources, that were harshly critical of Tim Walz. That's pretty unusual. And a lot of people, including me, interpreted that to mean that the National Party had the knives out and they may take Tim Walz off the ticket, just like they took Joe Biden off the ticket in 2024. And that's exactly what happened. The National Democratic Party decided that Walz was just too wounded by the fraud scandals, which continue to multiply. There was another one yesterday. There's more coming. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But they could see the handwriting on the wall. And they, in my opinion, they basically pulled Tim Walz out of the race. And everybody thinks that Amy Klobuchar is going to come back to Minnesota and be the Democrats' nominee.
Wow. So if Amy comes back, obviously she's well liked, I think, in Minnesota. Name, big high name ID. I saw Mr. Pillow or My Pillow, Mr. Lindahl, they're looking at running. What else is shaping up on the Republican ticket? Amy Klobuchar's in. That's going to be a tough, steep hill, it looks like to me.
Let's talk about that. Amy, obviously very well known in Minnesota. She's been in office for a long time. I think she is, in fact, the DFL's strongest candidate. That's why they want to run her. At least everybody thinks they want to run her. And however, every time she runs for re-election in the Senate, she does worse. And the last time she ran, I think it was 4 years ago, she only got 56% of the vote against a very weak Republican candidate who had no financing, but was not a strong candidate. So that's not any kind of overwhelming performance like a lot of senators. She's out of touch. She hasn't spent much time in Minnesota for quite a while. And if she comes back to run for governor, she's the candidate of the status quo. If you think things are going fine and you don't want any change, you vote for Amy or whoever it is that the DFL ultimately puts up. And so I guess we're going to find out whether voters in Minnesota are ready for some change or not. There's 8 or 9 or 10 people who have filed for the Republican nomination. They're not all serious candidates, but a number of them are. I would say that the serious candidates include Lisa Demuth, who is the highest ranking elected Republican in Minnesota. She's the Speaker of the Minnesota House. And Kristen Robbins, who is a member of the Minnesota House and the chairman of the anti-fraud committee, which was established in the House just last year. I think are strong candidates. Kendall Qualls, who almost got the Republican nomination in 2022, has thrown his hat in the ring again. And again, he's got a lot of support within the Minnesota Republican Party. And there are other candidates as well, but I think those 3 are probably the ones who could make the best race.
And so when you take a look at what's happened nationally, how is Trump? So when you look at midterms and what's happening with Trump, what would be your perception of where Minnesotans are? Obviously, you got metropolitan and St. Paul, Minneapolis, St. Paul. Rural may tend to be very conservative. Talk us through what the perception of Trump would be across Minnesota and the impact he would have in a race like that.
Yeah, so Trump is unpopular in the Minnesota suburbs. He's popular in rural areas. He's unpopular in the metro area. He tends to run about 5 points behind his national numbers in Minnesota. And so Tim Walz's strategy for re-election, if he had continued in the race, was to run against Donald Trump. Every time he gets up in front of a crowd, he doesn't talk about his record. He doesn't talk about Minnesota. He can't talk about his record. It's terrible. What he talks about is Donald Trump. And so I think whoever gets that nomination, whether it's Amy Klobuchar or maybe turns out to be somebody else, is going to follow the same strategy. Not talk about the record of what's been happening here in Minnesota under Democratic leadership, but try to run against Trump.
I read an article recently where Minnesota had like an $18 billion surplus and then ended up spending it and having to have a $10 billion increase in taxes to the taxpayers. I don't know if those numbers are accurate. Maybe you can shed some light on it, but that kind of spending, you can't sustain it. And that would really hopefully play into the Republican and the conservatives' hands, I would hope.
The record is so bad, Gary. It's so bad. And those numbers are right. It was a $17.6 billion surplus. They spent it all, every penny of it, and they raised taxes another $10 billion. They increased spending in that biennium by, I think it was 38%. That's unbelievable, the amount of money that our state government has been spending in Minnesota and the high taxes, obviously, to sustain that spending. And fraud is a huge issue. And of course, one of the reasons that our spending is so high is because so much money gets stolen. Again, we'll be talking about that as we continue the conversation. But a significant chunk of that Minnesota state budget has been going to criminals who are stealing the money from the taxpayer, while the Tim Walz administration looks the other way.
So, John, when we look at what's happened in Minnesota and the spending, I saw immigration, and we're going to pivot now a little bit. We're going to go to the break shortly, but I just heard where the Trump administration sending in a couple thousand ICE federal employees that come into Minnesota. That's going to put a pretty big spotlight on what happened in that fraud case, isn't it?
Yes and no, Gary. The interesting thing is that the frauds, and this has been going on for a long time. Some people around the country think it started with an internet video. Not true. Not true at all. 10 years ago, Somalis were being imprisoned for childcare fraud 10 years ago. This is an old story. It's been around for a while, and it is centered in the Somali community. Unfortunately, that's the reality. But these are not illegal immigrants. These are totally different stories. The fraud story is not an illegal immigration story. These people are overwhelmingly American citizens. And the ones that are not American citizens are classified as lawful residents. So yeah, the ICE agents, it'll be interesting to see what they turn up. We do have some illegal immigrants in the state. There's no question about that. And Minneapolis has been a sanctuary city, et cetera. But those two issues are really very separate.
We're going to focus on the fraud thing that's going on in Minnesota that we've been talking a little bit about in the previous segment. But John, as you stated earlier in an earlier segment, that this fraud situation in Minnesota didn't just pop up with an internet video where a young guy goes around, 25-year-old, and exposes it. It's been there for a long time, and your group has done a lot to expose it. Give us some more historical background on the fraud that's going on in Minnesota.
So in the last 4 years, this story goes back longer than that. It goes back 10 or 12 years. But in the last 4 years, the dominant story has been referred to as Feeding Our Future. And Feeding Our Future was a nonprofit, and it was one of a couple of nonprofits. Partners in Nutrition was another one. And they were supposed to be setting up sites, restaurants and other kinds of sites that would distribute meals to needy children during COVID. This is a federal program. 2/3 of the dollars, federal dollars, 1/3 of the dollars, I believe, state of Minnesota dollars. And what happened was that this program was overwhelmingly fraudulent. It became just a money machine for criminals. And in total, something like $500 million got stolen. These sites, and it was almost all Somalis, these sites, they would send an invoice for the cost of feeding 5,000 children, say. In reality, they fed 50 children, or maybe they fed 0 children, but they get paid for feeding 5,000. And if you did the math on the numbers, it was ridiculous. There's no way that these vast numbers of allegedly poor children are getting fed. And so that went on for years. And so Bill of our organization, Center of the American Experiment, has been really the guy whose coverage has driven the news on Feeding Our Future. He's been on this case for 4 long years, starting in January of 2022. And what happened in January of 2022 is that the FBI had been investigating what was going on here. And the FBI raided a number of these sites that were supposedly feeding all these poor children. And a whole bunch of people got caught and got arrested, including the people who ran Feeding Our Future, but also the people who were running these various fraudulent sites. And so the U.S. Attorney's Office here in the Twin Cities started prosecuting those criminal cases based on the FBI investigation. And it was just shocking. Hundreds of millions of dollars stolen. These fraudsters are buying Porsches and Lamborghinis and apartment buildings in Kenya and giant diamonds and rubies and emeralds. It's just unbelievable. It was the most brazen fraud that you can imagine. So thus far, 78 people have been indicted by the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Minnesota. 57 have been convicted. There have been 2 jury trials that have yielded convictions. There have been many other guilty pleas, and there's still another 20 or so cases that are pending. And those cases have been prosecuted by a guy named Joe Thompson, who's an assistant U.S. attorney, a tremendous lawyer who's done a fantastic job of investigating and leading the prosecution of these people. He's convicted one after another of these fraudsters, just doing a tremendous job. One of the things going on here is that the fraud is by no means limited to that program. It seems to span the entire range of welfare programs. In Minnesota, there was another program. It was actually under Medicaid. And the purpose of that program was to give people advice on how they could find housing. Seems weird for a Medicaid program, but that's what it was. And I think in 2 years, that program went from spending $3 million to spending over $100 million. And that was fine with Tim Walz. The Walz administration, they're just shelling out the dough. They don't ask any questions. They don't get curious. They don't get skeptical. But the FBI starts looking at it, and they realize that virtually every dollar in that program is fraudulent. These are fake homeless people that supposedly are being advised. The whole thing was a fraud. And that program has now been shut down. And the FBI has continued to investigate these other welfare programs, the joint, like the Medicaid programs that are joint federal and state. And about 3 weeks ago, this is why Tim Walz is not running for re-election, by the way. About 3 weeks ago, Joe Thompson, the assistant U.S. attorney, gave a press conference. And he said that in the last several years, I forget how many years exactly, 4 or 5 years, there's been $18 billion spent on Medicaid programs. Medicaid's an umbrella that covers a lot of things. It's not just healthcare for the poor. But he said there's been $18 billion spent. And the investigation that he and the FBI have done, his team and the FBI, suggests that a large percentage of that money was in fact fraud. And one of the reporters asks, when you say a large percentage, what are you talking about? And Joe Thompson said, half or more. And so if you hear people talking about the number $9 billion, that's where it comes from. It comes from Joe Thompson saying half or more of that $18 billion based on their investigation they believe to be fraudulent. That's why the National Democratic Party told Tim Walz, you're done. Because what they could see coming is for the next year, now the indictments are going to begin in those programs. Feeding Our Future is kind of winding down. But what we're going to see over the next year is, I don't know how many indictments, dozens, maybe hundreds of fraudsters in these other programs that have now been investigated with billions of dollars having been stolen. And that's going to be in the news on a daily basis from now until the November election.
So, John, when you look at the state having an $18 billion surplus and squandering it in spending of a 37% increase, I think you referred to.
I think 38, if I remember correctly.
38. Yes. I mean, it's unbelievable what that has done. And I assume, back to your point, and maybe 2/3 of it's federal money, which is just really probably the tip of the iceberg of the fraud programs. I want to talk in another segment a little bit more detail about even California, which you maybe don't have some background on specific because you're so close to Minnesota, but the fraud going on out there with this massive amount of same mentality that Minnesota has. It's hard to get your head around the squandering and disrespect for the citizens and the tax dollars being spent on programs like this.
Yeah, in my opinion, what's happened here in Minnesota, and I'm guessing something very similar has been happening in California and other states. I don't think we may be the worst, but we're not the only ones. And I think what's really been happening at the end of the day is a massive vote buying program. The DFL party has turned the Somali immigrant community of 100 to 150,000 here in Minnesota into a solid DFL voting bloc. And that's been enough to swing elections, not just in Minneapolis and not only in Hennepin County, although it's overwhelmingly strong in Minneapolis and Hennepin, but statewide elections clearly have been swung by those votes. And how have they done that? They've done that by, in my opinion, by pouring billions and billions of dollars into this relatively small and insular Somali community. And from the standpoint of Tim Walz and his cohorts, it doesn't really matter whether those are legitimate dollars under a particular welfare program or fraudulent dollars. It's kind of all the same. It's money. It's money that's being pumped out, money that's going into the hands of people who are allies of the Democratic Party. And so I think what we're seeing here is the classic age-old scheme of buying votes with other people's money.
Wow, that's unbelievable. When we sit in North Dakota, we don't have voter registration, and things sometimes can be fairly simple the way we do life compared to the way Minnesota does. And Republicans and people in office, they do stuff to get reelected. We get that's the process, right? But to fraudulently spend billions of dollars and just squander it and focus on a community like the Somalians. When I've gone to Minneapolis airport, I swear half the employees are Somalians.
Oh, at least,
a lot of the retail locations. And I just wonder how much of those federal or state employees, whether they show up or not, some of them, obviously many of them are legitimate, but where does the line get drawn in that?
It's a very sad situation. But one of the notable things about this whole sordid history of the 4 years we've been hearing about the Feeding Our Future scandal, it's all federal. The investigation, all federal. Prosecutions, all federal. Tim Walz and his Attorney General Keith Ellison haven't done a thing. They didn't lift a finger to stop the fraud, to see the fraud, to prosecute the fraud. If it was up to them, it would still be going on. They did nothing. And that's really pretty shocking. You'd think the Attorney General of a state would be in the middle of trying to uncover that kind of a mass criminal enterprise and prosecute it. And Keith Ellison has done nothing.
John, when you look at the politics of Minnesota, is this enough? Do people in these suburbs, these moms that take their kids to soccer or hockey or cheerleading, are they going to say enough's enough and our taxes are high enough? Or do they buy into that we just like taking care of people and we're just a much better people than the rest of the world? Is this going to?
I guess we're going to find out in November. I know there's a lot of people who are very sympathetic, very empathetic, got to help the other guy. I'm not sure how many people think that extends to buying them Lamborghinis. I don't know. I guess we're gonna find out.
So, John, we're going to go to the break and we come back. I'd like to dig in a little bit more the broader role that your group, the American Experiment, has been doing in Minnesota and continuing to expose other fraud. I recall back when we had talked a previous show about ESG and all the employees that the state hired to make sure everybody was ethnically diverse and everything they've done and on and on. I think there's so much good work you've done, and I think it's important for citizens of this country and state to understand the kind of work that's being done and others should do. So we've been talking to John Hinderaker of the American Experiment. I'm your host, Gary Emineth. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Done a lot of work on exposing fraud in Minnesota, but they also got a group in Fargo that's helping expand, exposing just kinds of things in North Dakota around education, et cetera. Great group, got great things. We're going to share some website information so you can get more information on it. Jennifer Benson heads up that program, as I understand, from Fargo. So, John, I would just, in the break, I was just thinking that maybe I need to go look at some apartment and spend part of my year in Minnesota and get some of this free handout money. Is it because they don't seem to check in? All you got to do is fill out the paperwork online from what I've been reading, and they just send you a check. And is that?
It got so bad. And this is something Joe Thompson had pointed out in a press conference. This is something that nobody's ever heard of before, but it's fraud tourism. It got so well known in the criminal world that anybody could defraud the state of Minnesota that people came here from Philadelphia for the sole purpose of defrauding our state. And what they realized is if you send an invoice to one of these Minnesota state agencies, they'll just pay it. And so we're attracting criminals around the country who have heard that anybody could steal money in Minnesota. It's unbelievable how incompetent our government has been.
John, when you look at it, you obviously got an auditor department. We got a great auditor in North Dakota, and sometimes the Republicans don't like that he's going to hold these people accountable. But is that Democrat run, or like in North Dakota, the auditor's elected by the people? Does Minnesota's auditor come underneath the governor's purview so they can just ignore it? Or
there's two auditors. One of them is elected statewide, and that person currently is a Democrat, but the powers of that office are actually rather limited. There's also an office of the legislative auditor, and that is a nonpartisan office that for a number of years has been held by people who do a really good job. And the legislative auditor did a terrific report on the Feeding Our Future scandal, investigating it, talking about the dollars, reviewing the documents, and trying to answer the question of why did this happen? And the legislative auditor concluded that the fundamental cause of the Feeding Our Future scandal was the culture in Minnesota's Department of Education, which administered that particular program. And it was a culture that was all about writing checks, with no sense of accountability, no sense of stewardship of the taxpayers' money. It was a culture that was all about just push the money out the door, no questions asked. So we have had that kind of effective oversight coming at least out of that office.
So, John, when you said most of the investigation's been federal, and I mentioned earlier about Trump sending a couple thousand ICE people, obviously that can have a negative impact. I'm a big Hilton guy. I stay in Hiltons all my life. I'm actually a lifetime Diamond member because I've stayed in way too many Hilton hotels. But I'm sitting here thinking, I need to boycott those guys. I'm frustrated. They're sending the federal agents in to look at it. And I saw locally, they said that they're not welcome to stay in their hotels. And I think the national organization said, no, time out. But do you think there's going to be pushback regarding sending so many people in? Of course, 2,000 people, if they focus on investigation, is a massive amount dealing with deportation and all that kind of stuff. Give me your reaction to what you think will happen with that.
First of all, let me just comment on the story that you mentioned there, Gary, which is it was actually a Hampton Inn in Lakeville, Minnesota. And there were some guys who'd made reservations at that hotel. And somebody at the hotel somehow figured out that these are ICE agents. And so they told them in writing, oh, we're canceling your reservation. We don't allow ICE people to stay at our hotel. And these people reported that to their superiors. And I forget who, but the Department of Homeland Security did a tweet and they showed copies of these communications from the hotel saying, oh, no, your reservations are canceled because you work for ICE. And it got nationwide attention. People are saying, are you kidding me? This is insane. And Hampton Inns are owned by the Hilton Corporation. So Hilton looked into it and they put out a statement saying, this is not our policy. We do not condone this. And I think they terminated the franchise of the people who actually owned that Hampton Inn.
That's crazy. Yeah, because many of the hotels are investment groups that have one property, 10 properties.
Right.
It's a franchise brand. But the
Right.
fact that now I guess I'll probably keep staying there because I've stayed in, I hate to say it, probably thousands of Hampton Inns.
I like Hampton Inns. I've stayed in way too many of them myself. I know what you're talking about. But to go to your other question about this massive infusion of ICE agents into the Twin Cities, I'm all in favor of enforcing the immigration laws, right? If people are here illegally, they should leave. That's the rule of law. I don't think there's any great doubt about that. I don't know what they're going to find. They obviously prioritize criminal elements wherever they go, and they find plenty of them, the murderers, the rapists, the thieves, and so on. And we'll see what happens. There is pushback already, and there's going to be more pushback in places like Minneapolis and St. Paul. We're going to see people following ICE agents around and videoing them and trying to warn people, watch out, here come the feds, having demonstrations against law enforcement. All they're doing is enforcing the law. And that didn't used to be controversial, but now apparently it is. And so we're going to be seeing some of those scenes. We're going to see video footage on the evening news of protesters trying to interfere with ICE agents in carrying out their work and trying to make arrests. That's a crime. If you interfere with a police officer, an ICE agent, an FBI agent, whatever it may be, a deputy sheriff, in trying to make an arrest, that's a crime. And I hope it doesn't turn violent. I don't think it probably will, but I'm sure we're going to see a lot of that kind of thing going on in the next days.
John, I used to go to Minneapolis regularly, and I'd love to stay downtown. And after the whole demolishing and burning the downtown Minneapolis, and it just was destroyed, from your perspective, has downtown recovered? Because to be honest with you, I went down shortly thereafter, tried to stay there. Everything was boarded up. And then I went back 6 months later. And that had to hurt so many people in that city that are just independent, whether they work at a local business, property owners, homeowners, business owners. As they've recovered from that, there's got to be some backlash from that.
Minneapolis has recovered partly. I'll tell you what hasn't recovered is St. Paul. St. Paul is the one that's really a ghost town. But Minneapolis is partly recovered, but has never fully recovered. I know that a year or 2 years even after the COVID fiasco was completely done, somebody did an analysis involving cell phones. There are records you can get at of the number of cell phones that are in various locations. And so they analyzed those data for like the 100 or 200 or something biggest cities in the United States. And they found that some cities had more than rebounded. Salt Lake City had 110 or some such percent of the number of cell phones in downtown Salt Lake City compared to before the COVID epidemic. Out of all the cities that were researched, Minneapolis is like second from the bottom in terms of not coming back. They had, I'm going from memory here and it's been a while, but I think it was like 40% the number of phones that there had been in downtown Minneapolis compared to pre-COVID. So Minneapolis has had one of the slowest, least successful rebounds from, and it wasn't just COVID, of course, it was crime. And the authorities always want to talk about COVID, but a big part of the reason why a lot of people aren't going to downtown Minneapolis is crime. And the most shocking, I'll tell you the most shocking fact in this whole story is the Ameriprise building, which is in the heart of downtown Minneapolis. It's a 26-story, I think 25-story new office building, beautiful office building, heart of downtown Minneapolis. That building, I think it was in 2017, sold for $200 million. A year ago, that building sold for $6 million. its value declined by 97%. It was empty. There are no tenants. There are no buyers. There are no takers. That's just an unbelievable story. 97% decline in value of a nice new modern building in downtown Minneapolis. So what's happened is that these events and just the fecklessness of the Minneapolis City Council, which is terrible, they have just destroyed the commercial property tax base in that city. And as a result, those commercial property tax revenues are not what they used to be by a mile. So what are they doing? They can't cut their budget. That's what they should do. But of course, they won't do that. Instead, they say we got to collect more property tax from the homeowners. And so there have been big increases in residential property taxes. What that does is it drives down the value of your house. And so they're really in what could turn out to be a death spiral in the city of Minneapolis as a result of that devastation of the commercial property tax base. So yeah, those are serious ongoing problems.
So John, just briefly, talk to us a little bit about Minneapolis being a sanctuary city and the impact it's had on immigration and what you've seen related to that, because obviously that's part of it.
Yeah, the cities, there's a number of places that have declared themselves sanctuaries around the state of Minnesota, Minneapolis and St. Paul among them. And I don't know, honestly, how much difference that has made. I don't know it happens all the time. There's a crime story. And then when you find out, not just in Minneapolis, but all over the state, and then they catch the criminal, and then it's in the newspaper and you find out he's an illegal alien. Happens over and over again. And I don't know what statistics there are, but a significant chunk of the crime in the state, I believe, is being committed by illegal aliens.
John, we're going to go to the break. When we come back, I want to dig in a little bit more on this fraud, but I also want to talk a little bit more about your organization so the viewers on Open Range can get familiar and find ways to support you guys, and I appreciate all that you're doing. So, John, your organization has done some amazing work. I've had a number of your people talking, Caitlin, on regarding education and just the way you lobby and get involved in educational purposes, whether it's education in general, but just government spending, growth of government, all of that. Tell us a little bit more about your organization, some of the things you've done and discovered, even related to fraud as we go from here.
So we cover all of the issues that are of perennial concern to state and local government. We have two economists working for us. We write a lot about the economy of Minnesota as well as North Dakota. We write about taxes and spending at the state and local level. We write about education, as you mentioned, healthcare, energy, public safety. We cover all the main issues. But one point I really want to emphasize, Gary, is we've been talking a lot about fraud, and fraud is in the news. Obviously, it's a huge issue. But I want to make sure our viewers understand that there's a bigger issue. In other words, in Minnesota in particular, there have been billions of dollars that have just been stolen from the taxpayers by criminals. But there's a much broader issue, and that is the issue of waste. Not money that's being stolen by criminals, but money that is being spent wastefully, legally, but wastefully by our state government. And we do a summer tour every year. We'll go to 24, 25 cities around the state of Minnesota, put on a program. And this summer of 25, it was Minnesota Doge, ways in which our state budget should be cut. And we actually identified billions of dollars in spending that we think can and should be cut so that Minnesota can cut our taxes. We're driving residents away. We're driving businesses away because our taxes are too high. If we want lower taxes, we got to have less spending. And we've been real specific about areas in which our state government just wastes tons and tons of money. You mentioned something earlier, Gary. This is not one of the big dollar amounts, but it's typical. We did some research, and one of the things we found is that there are hundreds of state employees whose job titles indicate that they are DEI employees. They're responsible for diversity, equity, and inclusion in a particular government agency. Some of them have job titles that just make you laugh. They're so kind of out there. And so millions of dollars are being spent by our government on enforcing these often illegal quota requirements that go under the heading of DEI. So that's just one of many examples. It's not fraud, it's not crime, it's just wasteful spending by our state government. One of the things that we do every year that's really fun, Gary, and I'm sure you've seen this, we have the Golden Turkey Award. We get nominations from people who go to our website, who read our magazine, who follow us on social media. Wasteful state of Minnesota government spending. And we select 4 programs or four projects, items of wasteful spending, and they're the nominees for the annual Golden Turkey Award. And then people vote on social media. Who do you think should win the Golden Turkey? And it's a lot of fun, and we have these spirited competitions. Somebody actually made an award for us, a physical award that we hand out now, and thousands of people vote the Golden Turkey Award. And we do this as just a fun way of highlighting the crazy ways in which the state of Minnesota wastes the taxpayers' money.
John, I recall when we had a previous show with DEI that it seems to me you were talking like 160 employees that had DEI titles. And I remember asking you,
I think it was 317. I'm going from memory, Gary.
317. And I remember asking you and saying, so these are not $50,000 employees. And you go, no, they're $100,000 salaries with benefits that go with it. And you just do the math. So it's 300 plus at 100K. When you talk about wasteful spending, you got to scratch your head and say, what the?
After we publicized that was based on a review of government websites, so the agency websites. And after we publicized that, people started emailing us and saying, you missed some, because we could only identify them by job title. People would say, oh yeah, you missed some. There's one in my agency. He's got a different title, but that's the same thing. It's DEI.
So, John, when you look at other wasteful spendings, and you talked about 4 areas, or you actually, with your Golden Turkey, you looked at 4 different avenues. But give us some examples of things that your group has identified as just wasteful spending that you say, in North Dakota, the list goes on. We have the same issue. We have so much money from oil. In your case, you just take it away from all your taxpayers.
Gary, how much time have you got? Let me just tick off a few that I think are.
But give us a
couple of years ago, they're building the Taj Mahal over in St. Paul as the Minnesota House office building. They don't even need it. They don't need the space. They got a perfectly good building. I forget how many millions, but hundreds of millions, unbelievable amounts of money. So that was one that won. There was one that won a couple of years ago. It was a new bus stop. They spent millions of dollars on this beautiful new bus stop over in St. Paul with this big parking lot that'll hold 300 cars. Only it turns out there's not a single bus that stops at that bus stop. Not one. It's the bus stop where no buses stop. They built a rest area on Highway 35 north of the Twin Cities. And it's this beautiful rest area. Again, they spent millions of dollars, and it's got this curving Brazilian wood and curving glass walls and bathrooms. You'd think you're in the Hyatt Hotel. And it's ironic because if you look out these curving glass windows, what do you see? You see a forest, right? One thing that we don't lack for in Minnesota is wood. Right. And nevertheless, they imported wood from Brazil for this unbelievably lavish public bathroom. Another of my favorites, again, it's not how much money they spend necessarily. It's sometimes just how crazy it is. One that I really enjoyed last year, one of the nominees, they gave a $10,000 grant to some young guy from northern Minnesota to produce podcasts on the subject of the game Dungeons and Dragons for the benefit of greater Minnesota. It's like, why are you doing this? $10,000 for a Dungeons and Dragons podcast. We do a lot of things, but the Golden Turkey is one of the fun things that we do to highlight the wasteful spending and point out ways in which it should be cut.
So, John, talk to us about your election coming up. What do you see happening? Do your legislators get elected to 4-year terms? And what do you see happening when you do an analysis of this coming election within the next 12 months, 9 months?
Yeah. So 26 is a huge year in Minnesota. Everything is up. Our governor, our attorney general, the constitutional offices, they're always up in the mid-year elections, 2022, 2026. The Senate is up every 4 years. The Senate is up in 26. The House is up every 2 years. So every single elected office in Minnesota is up this year. And so it's going to be an epic election in Minnesota. Our polling, we poll every quarter for our magazine, Thinking Minnesota, the Thinking Minnesota poll. And we always ask people, do you consider yourself liberal, moderately liberal, middle of the road, moderately conservative? And every quarter, there are way more Minnesotans who say they're conservative than liberal, way more. This is not a crazy socialist left-wing state. And we don't poll elections, we poll issues. And on issue after issue, most Minnesotans are on the conservative side of the issue. It doesn't matter if you're talking about crime, spending, education. Most Minnesotans agree with conservative positions on issues. And so 2026 is going to be, I think, a really pivotal election in which we learn how many Minnesotans are really ready to vote for change. Things have not been going well in our state. In 2024, for the first time in history, we are now a below average state economically. Minnesota always used to be a prosperous state. Now our per capita GDP is below the national average. Never happened before. The Tim Walz administration has been a disaster. We used to be a low crime state. Now our serious crime rate is above the national average. We've got more than half of our kids, K through 12, can neither read nor do math at grade level, more than half. So the numbers are very bad. And so this is going to be a pivotal election where Minnesotans are going to have to decide, do they want to vote for more of the same, or do they want to vote to try to make things better?
So, John, in the last minute or so, minute and a half here, can you give us a little bit about your Fargo office and Jennifer and what you're doing in North Dakota, please?
Yes, I think this is our fourth year operating in North Dakota. As you said, Jennifer Benson is our executive director. Kim Koppelman, former Speaker of the North Dakota House, is a policy fellow there. We've done a lot of work. We support the oil and gas industry. We worked for choice in education. We worked to help try to control spending and keep taxes down, income taxes, property taxes. We've been active on a lot of issues in North Dakota, and our people have been really influential, really spending a lot of time talking to legislators in Bismarck and promoting conservative ideas and conservative policies. And by the way, and we have our own website, North Dakota webpage. So if you go to americanexperiment.org, that's our main webpage, and americanexperimentnd.org is devoted specifically to our North Dakota operation.
I appreciate that because I've had a number of your policy fellows on the show. I've had Jennifer Benson on. I also see she looks like she's running for the legislature, which I'm excited to see that happening.
Yeah.
Those are all good things in getting people involved in the process.
Absolutely, Gary. And we've really enjoyed operating in North Dakota and plan to be there for a long time to come.
John, thank you for joining us as things unfold. We might even have some of your other policy fellows on, specifically the fraud, but education. You guys do great work. I appreciate it. Thank you for coming out and spending a day with us.
Great to be with you, Gary.
We've been talking to John Hinderaker, president of Center for American Experiment. I'm your host, Gary Emineth. Thanks for watching.